it's really important to understand all the functions, features and modes within our cameras, we also need to have a very deep understanding of our camera lenses. Our camera lenses are incredible engineering feat with the ability to capture and control light, and is our view of the world through our camera. There's lots to understand about lenses. As you can see here, we have lots of different numbers, lots of different focal lengths, and it can be very, very difficult to understand exactly what all of these numbers mean. But we'll demystify all of that within this lesson so that you're getting a deeper understanding of your lenses and what is the best lens for you to use with your photography. My name is William Eames. Welcome back to the Professional Diploma in Photography. Welcome to lesson number 3. Now, as usual, just the briefest little bit of housekeeping to get through for those of you who happen to be joining the class for the very first time. So you can download our app. It's the best way to view those lessons. So if you're watching on a tablet, you're watching on the go, you're watching on your phones, you can still keep up with the lessons. It is also, of course, possible to manage and watch your classes through our website, www.shawacademy.com. And don't forget about those recordings. They are always available there for you as well to catch up in your own time. You can manage your classes through your login area. You can change the class date and time. Make sure you've added it to your calendar if you haven't done so already, or if you are falling behind, or perhaps you've missed the first 2 lessons. It is possible to restart the entire course through the app as well. So let's get on into lesson number 3. Now, in the previous lesson, I mentioned all about sensor sizes and lenses, and it does come back into play in this lesson. So as we discovered in the previous lesson, there's lots of different sensor sizes depending on the type of camera that you are using. And while it can be quite difficult to distinguish now between the image quality, where it does have an impact is on our camera lenses. Not all lenses are going to fit all cameras, and it's largely in part due to the different brands, different mounts, but also with the image sensor sizes as well. Now, I don't want to overcomplicate things at this stage by getting too in depth into our sensor sizes, but what's important for you to understand in this lesson is that we're going to be talking about all these examples as if we were using a full frame camera. That is a sensor size that is 35 millimeters, okay, which is the same size as our film cameras, 35 millimeter film. This is the standard and was the standard throughout the 20th century. Our full frame camera is our 35 millimeter sensor size. But always be sure to check lens compatibility with your camera before buying the lens. Always check online or with your local camera shop. But for those of you who are a little bit more advanced and are wondering, we are going to be using a 35 millimeter full frame camera sensor size as the example throughout the rest of this lesson. Now, it'll make much more sense to you as we continue on through this lesson and we start putting it into practice. But let's first of all have a look at our lens components. Before we do that, we need to basically break down our lenses into 2 types of construction. We have zoom lenses. Zoom lenses are any lens with a variable or changeable focal length. Okay, so this is basically any lens that can zoom in and out. Now, zoom lenses doesn't specifically refer to lenses that are used for photographing objects that are very, very far away. Say if you're on safari and you're trying to photograph the elephants off in the distance. A zoom lens is any lens that has the capability to zoom in and out. It doesn't matter how far it zooms in or out, but if it can zoom in and out, that is a zoom lens. As we can see here, displayed on it, we have 18 to 135 millimeters. That means this lens at its widest starts at 18 millimeters, but when we zoom in, by rotating it, it zooms into 135 millimeters and everything else in between. Okay, the other type of construction then we have are what are known as prime or fixed lenses. And these are lenses that have only one focal length. Like for example with this 50 millimeter Sigma lens, it is 50 millimeters. It does not change from that. If we want to zoom in, we need to physically get closer to our subject. If we want to zoom out, we need to physically take a couple of steps backwards if we want to fit more in the shot. So that is the distinction between those two lens constructions. Okay, zoom lenses, you can zoom in and out. It has a variable focal length. Fixed lenses only have one focal length. Now, as we're going to see, they're available in huge different types of varieties of different focal lengths. We'll have a look at that a little bit later on in the lesson. But just like we did in lesson number 2 when we were breaking down our cameras, let's have a look at the various lens components and break down all of these different numbers that are on our lenses. So we start with our current focal length. So we can see the ring around the lens here is our current focal length. There's little indication telling us that we're at 24 millimeters. Currently, this is a zoom lens. It'll zoom up to 70 millimeters as is displayed on the lens. We can zoom in and out using our zoom ring here. We can also check the distance here as well. Now, this isn't available on every lens. It is available on more advanced lenses. This is for working out focusing distances without having to look through the camera's viewfinder. But it's a much more advanced topic. We don't really need to concern ourselves with it for now. We have our AF/MF switch, which is for changing to autofocus or manual focus. We have our focusing ring. So for photographing in manual focus, we can focus using the focusing ring here. We have our lens cap, which is pretty self-explanatory. Then around here we have our lens and aperture info. So here we've got, again, we can see lots of information. So it's a zoom lens. It's electronic focus, which is EF. 24 to 70 millimeters is the range, and it starts at f4. Now, we will talk about this number a lot more in detail in upcoming lessons. L stands for luxury, which is just unique to the Canon lenses. It just means it's a high quality lens. IS is image stabilization, and USM is ultrasonic motor. There's a lot of information to take in there. But basically what this means is it's a 24-70 millimeter lens with an aperture range starting from f4. It also has image stabilization in it as well, and is very quiet at focusing. Again, we can find all of that information here as well. And then, of course, we have our rear lens cap. Anytime you are not using your lens and it's not attached to your camera, you should have your rear lens cap attached. Your rear lens element is where all the electronics are stored that will allow the camera to communicate with your lens. So if it ever gets damaged, it's going to be very, very costly to repair. So make sure that you have your rear lens cap on anytime you're not using your lens. Just having a look at the front of the lens. This is our front lens element. The glass in our lenses is called elements. So if you ever hear somebody talking about the elements in a lens, how many elements are in that lens, etc., they're talking about the glass within the lens. We have a bayonet for a lens hood, so to attach a lens hood to prevent any kind of unwanted glare, we can use our lens hood, and that's the bayonet around for it. We have our focal length and aperture info displayed on the front of the lens as well. So in this case, we're now using a 24 to 105 millimeter lens. Okay, we have a thread for attaching filters like UV filters, neutral density filters, polarizing filters, all of which we'll talk about in module number 2. And finally then, we have the diameter of our lens front. This is so that when we're buying our filters and lens caps, that we get the correct size. So in this case, it's 77 millimeters. That means from across, okay? From this point to this point, all the way across, no matter what point you take, it's the circumference or the diameter of the front of the lens. Now, you've heard me say the phrase focal length an awful lot throughout this lesson already. But what is focal length? Well, basically, focal length refers to the millimeter range on the lens. So every lens you're going to see some type of a millimeter range. And basically, in technical terms, it is the distance where the photo becomes focused in the lens measured from the camera's image sensor. Okay, now to simplify that, what that means is the lower the number, the wider the lens and the photograph. Okay, because that means that the image becomes in focus closer to the image sensor. If you're using a telephoto lens, the higher the number, the closer the lens and the photo. In other words, the more zoomed in your subject is. So for example, a 20 millimeter lens is a wide lens. A 200 millimeter lens is a zoomed in or a telephoto lens. It's 10 times more zoomed in compared to our 20 millimeter lens. Okay, so that's just the simplified version of it. The lower the millimeter, the wider the lens, the higher the millimeter, the more zoomed in or the closer you are going to be to your subject. Now, just a couple of other components to speak about before we get on to our different lens types. Image stabilizers, we did talk about them briefly in the last lesson. So image stabilizers, sometimes known as VR, sometimes known as OS, etc. You can switch these on and off. They'll help to prevent camera shake at slower shutter speeds, or when if you're using very long lenses or telephoto lenses, it's going to be important to keep the lenses stabilized as possible. So image stabilizers is a great help there. It's also available in body on some cameras, depending on the type of camera. So as I mentioned, cameras like Sony, Olympus, Pentax, these all have their image stabilizers in the body. The benefit of that is that it turns any lens into an image stabilized lens, as opposed to something like Nikon or Canon, where the image stabilizer is actually located within the lens itself. Now, the final component to have a look at is an optional one, which is our lens hood. And a lens hood is very, very simple, very, very straightforward. It's simply a device that's using the front end of the lens to block out the sun and other light sources to prevent any glare or lens flare. These are not universal, though. You will have to check for your own lens. Usually they will come packaged with any brand new lens, but if you're looking to buy one online, you need to make sure you're getting the correct one for your brand of lens. Now, you can get ones that are universal. They're kind of these rubber ones, but I recommend going with the plastic ones if possible, because they're just much better at blocking out the sun. I use them all the time. It just helps to prevent any kind of unwanted stray light from creeping into your photographs. And be honest, they look pretty kind of cool as well. So they just add a nice aesthetic to the end of the lens too. Now, with that in mind, I want you to let us know, what lens are you using? What lens are you currently using to take photographs with? Are you using the kit lens? Are you using your mobile phone lens? Or perhaps there's a particular lens that you have a fondness for? Let us know what lens you are using. And remember, you can chat to Morpheus. Simply type in your answers there. If you have any questions at all throughout the course or throughout this lesson, simply type them into Morpheus there as well. Do remember to rate those responses so we can best answer them for you. And just to let you know, my personal favourite lens, or my personal favourite focal lens, is an 85mm. Now, you will hear a lot of photographers mention that one as their favourite. I find it's just a great in-between lens. It's not hugely versatile, but it's great for photographing people. It is kind of more geared towards taking portraits, but I find it to be very, very nice focal length. 50mm is also hugely versatile, I find, and if there was one lens that I would recommend to everybody, it is to get themselves a 50mm lens. I'll speak about that now in just a second as we move on into lens types. Now, before we go looking at lens types, we need to quickly understand angle of view. An angle of view, it's not the same as point of view. Okay, so point of view is when whatever direction we choose to photograph in. Angle of view is actually how much your lens is capable of seeing. Let's just have a look at this. So when we talk about the angle of human vision, let me ask you a question, another question. What do you think is the full angle of human vision? Okay, so when I say angle, I'm talking about, in degrees. So do you think it's 360 degrees? No, it definitely isn't, because we can't see behind our own heads. Do you think it's 180 degrees? Do you think it's 90 degrees? Type it in there to Morpheus and think about this. Look straight forward and look at your entire human vision now. Take into account your peripheral vision as well. And the angle is somewhere near 130 degrees. 130 degrees, that is the entire angle of human vision. Now, when we talk about focused human vision, that's a lot smaller. So again, if you just look straight forward at what's in focus in front of your eyes, how much degrees do you think is in focus? So obviously we can't see what's in focus in our peripheral vision. We're just aware of it because it's a survival instinct, but it's not in focus until we actually look at it. The actual angle of focused human vision is 50 degrees. And indeed, our 50mm lenses match this very, very closely, which is why I think a 50mm lens is pretty much a must-have for every photographer. Don't need to rush out and buy one straight away, but I do think it's very worthwhile having one of those in the future. So that is the focused angle of human vision. Now, if we compare this then to our different focal lengths, so all the way from our fisheye up to 600mm, you can see then as we zoom in, as our lenses get longer, the angle of vision becomes much more narrow. It becomes narrower. So something like a fisheye lens actually has the capability of seeing beyond our peripheral vision, which is why we get these odd looking images, these kind of distorted photographs. But again, like extreme wide angle lenses, these would be very close. They're 114 degrees. They'd be close enough to our peripheral vision, our full range of vision. But as we zoom in, our field of distance, our angle of vision becomes very, very narrow. So a 600mm lens can be very tricky to use because you've got such a small angle of vision, only 4 degrees there. so it can be quite tricky to use those lenses. But let's have a look at all the lenses that are available to us, beginning with one that should be available to the majority of us, which are our smartphone lenses. And basically, these types of lenses are designed to be very, very wide. Now, this is kind of a dual lens design here, but typically most smartphones will have just the front camera and the rear camera with one lens for each. It is designed to be a wide angle lens so that it can get as much in view as possible. It keeps things nice and sharp as well. It has a fixed aperture. This means no depth of field control. So we can't control the aperture, meaning we cannot control the depth of field like we are going to see in later lessons through our lens. But we can achieve depth of field in other ways, and that is by getting closer to the subject. So if you're doing, say, macro photography, you simply hold the phone closer to the subject, it'll create a depth of field. But some other phones as well will try to recreate this effect as well through other ways. Okay, whether it's through kind of post-editing and that, applying types of different filters and that. But it's not really the exact same as controlling it properly through our lenses. But they're great for everyday use, particularly for landscapes and portraits, and they're really good for macro and food because we're actually able to get that lens in very, very close to the subject. As you can imagine, though, not very versatile when it comes to wildlife or sports or fast-moving objects because it's very, very difficult to get very, very close. And that means we don't really have much creative control because we don't really have much control over the exposure. We have very limited control over shutter speed. But because we're limited, we're restricted by a single focal length, it can be very, very difficult to try and get the shot. But most are not also good in low light situations without a flash. Now, this is, of course, always improving, always improving. The technology is always getting better and better and better. Samsung, iPhone, they kind of lead the way with their technology in improving the quality of photographs taken in low light situations. So it's getting better all the time. But there are also attachments available. So, despite the fact that our lenses in the camera or in the phone itself are fixed focal length, it is possible to buy lots of different attachments. So we can attach, if we wanted to get wider, we can attach wide angle lenses. We can also attach telephoto lenses as well, or a huge different range of them. And they range from about €10 to €100 altogether. A couple of recommended brands here: Amir, Stune, Zotouch, Moment White. There's so many of them out there, though. The list is endless. And you're going to be able to find them, your usual suspects: Amazon, eBay, and certainly in your local camera shop as well. They're very, very easy to use. They clip onto your camera. Just make sure you get the right one for your brand of phone. One that's made for an iPhone is going to be positioned differently compared to one that's made for a Samsung or a HTC or some other type of brand. Now, moving into our camera lenses, our mirror and our DSLR lenses, let's start off by having a look at a general purpose lens. And general purpose lenses, well, I think you can guess what they're used for. They are used for everyday general purpose photography. So the aforementioned 50mm, that would be considered a general purpose lens. They're designed for all round use. Now, they range from about 24 to 105 millimeters. As you would see, that's kind of a standard kit lens when we're using a full frame camera. It's 18 to 55 if you're using a cropped sensor camera, would be the kind of standard range there as well. Your standard kit lens. It's a good all-rounder, good for landscapes, people, street and studio. It doesn't excel in anything though. That's kind of what makes these lenses. They're very general, but they don't excel in one particular area. but this is a great lens, a great type of lens just to carry around all the time. Aperture ranges will vary again depending on the focal length, whether it's a zoom lens or a prime lens. But again, we'll speak about that in a later lesson. It's a great lens to start with, and is generally included as the kit lens in most cameras. As I said back in the first lesson, the lens that comes with your camera is a great place to start. There's no need to rush out and buy a brand new lens. And of course, they're available as fixed or zoom versions. So you can get general purpose lenses like a 24 to 105, or you can have a fixed version like a 50 millimeter or 40 millimeter, or a 70 millimeter, and so on. So there's a big range there available, all available as either zoom versions or as fixed versions as well. Now, if we want to get closer to the subject, we're going to be looking at using telephoto lenses. And when I say closer to the subject, I'm not talking about macro photography. I'm talking about getting closer to wildlife, to birds, to sports photography. We would be using a telephoto lenses. And telephoto lens is very distinctive looking. You're going to be talking about a range from about 70 to 300 millimeters. This means they have a very narrow field of view. So as I mentioned earlier, they can be quite tricky to use because you can't really see much around you. They're used for wildlife, for sports, but they can also be used for street and portraiture. It's good for getting candid shots of your subjects from far away, but they are a high price. They're typically a higher price than your standard kind of general zoom lenses. Now, fast versions come at a high cost. What I mean by that is a telephoto lens that has a very wide aperture range is going to be very, very expensive. So you'll be paying thousands of dollars for a fast version of a telephoto lens. And as I mentioned, they can be tricky to use. They can also be very heavy to use as well. And because you have a longer focal length, they are more prone to getting camera shake. It can be very hard to keep these steady when you're hand holding them. Super telephoto versions are even harder to use, and this is basically any lens that's got a range from 300 millimeters plus. So they're also incredibly expensive as well. They're very, very large. You'll see these are ones that usually are used at the sides of football matches or at the sides of soccer matches, rugby, any kind of sports event. You'll see sports photographers with these gigantic lenses. They're typically a super telephoto range. They're also very, very heavy, so you'd be using a monopod with them as well to try and keep them nice and steady. Really for wildlife and sports photography primarily, although you'll see paparazzi using them, of course, as well, and will require a monopod and a tripod for extra support. Now, going the extreme opposite then, we have our wide angle lenses for photographing magnificent landscapes like this one here. And wide angle lenses is anything less than 24 millimeters, and it takes more into view than our focused field of vision. So remember, our focused field of vision was 50 degrees. Using a wide angle lens, we're going to see much more than this. So you want to be sure to check the edges of the frame when you're using these lenses, because we have a tendency just to look straight into the center. But because we're actually seeing more than what we typically see when we're using these lenses, you want to be sure to run your eye over the edges of the frame as well. Some distortion may appear at the edges with these lenses, the wider that they get, but they're very versatile. You can use them for landscapes, architecture, street. They can be used for portraits as well. And a really good area for these is for night sky photography. Okay, so taking photographs at night of the night sky, a wide angle lens is great for getting thousands and thousands and thousands of stars in the sky, presuming that you can actually see them. It's not cloudy or you're not somewhere where there's light pollution. And just like their telephoto counterparts, there is also a super or an extreme wide version available as well. as you can see, for doing photographs like this architectural shot here. And this is anything that goes extremely wide, usually about the 10 to 15 millimeter range, very wide angle of view. Anything wider is fisheye lens. They are expensive lenses as well. Usually when you go extreme, whether it's telephoto or whether it's wide angle lenses, you're going to be spending a lot more money because they're considered specialist lenses. They're landscapes primarily, architectural photography as well, and very distorted at the edges, so will need some post-production. Now, as I said, going beyond that, going even wider than that, we have the ubiquitous fisheye lens. Ubiquitous, I say that because, you know, when we see a fisheye photograph, we recognize it straight away as being a fisheye shot because we get those really distorted edges that you can see here, that curvature that we get, you know, here as we can see in the London skyline. We're beginning to get a little bit of distortion at the edges there. That can be corrected if you want to, but it kind of adds to the effect. It adds to the look and the distinct look of these lenses. Now, fisheye lenses are a lot of fun to use, but they are a limited lens. They're about 8 to 15 millimeters in range, so incredibly wide. Curved elements, as you can see here, they create a very distinct look. They are very, very fun to use, but they are also very, very expensive. Again, these are specialist lenses. And in my opinion, they are quite limited with what you can do with them. They're often used for extreme sports and creative photography like music, for skateboarding. They're kind of synonymous as well with GoPro. So everybody kind of knows the GoPro look, the videos where you got the very distorted edges and that, you get a really, really wide shot. So for that kind of extreme sports, very, very good for that. And again, really good for night sky photography because you get a huge amount of the sky in the shot as well. Finally then, macro lenses are hugely popular. I get asked about these lenses all the time, but macro itself is actually quite a technical, complex subject, so much so that we actually have an entire lesson dedicated to it in module number 2. Because there's quite a lot to cover with it. But to quickly go over macro lenses. Macro lenses, again, these are considered special lenses. They are available at various focal lengths. Okay, so you can get them at, ranges starting from about 40, then 50, 60, 70 millimeters, up to about 100 millimeters. And they are usually a fixed lens. You won't really find the zoom versions of macro lenses. Now, some lenses will have a macro feature on the macro function, but they don't work the exact same way as a dedicated macro lens. Now, basically, how a macro lens differs from our regular lenses is that their minimal focusing distance is much closer than a standard lens. If you try to focus on an object very, very close with your normal lens, you're going to find that it's going to not be able to focus. At a certain distance, when you get too close, your lens simply cannot focus. Macro lenses go beyond this and will allow you to focus beyond this minimal focusing distance. But they are much more expensive than regular lenses, and they're actually great for portraiture as well. But as I said, there's an entire lesson about them in module number 2. Now, so that's the end of lesson number 3. I do hope that you enjoyed it. I certainly enjoyed bringing it to you. Now, our next lesson, lesson number 4, we're going to dive into one topic in particular and look at it in depth, which is composition. So we're going to move away from our kind of technical stuff, our technical area and all of that, and we're going to concentrate on just seeing and looking as a photographer and taking better photographs. So your lesson challenge for this lesson is to simply post up a photograph that you took and tell us the focal length that was used. Did you use 50mm? Did you use a 300mm? Did you use a 72mm focal length? Let us know what focal length you took and post that up on facebook.com/Shaw Academy. So thank you so much for joining me for lesson number 3. I'll see you all back here soon for lesson number 4. So until then, take care.